Thank you. Thank you, everyone, for your patience. Andreas's work has a lot to do about the, let's say, the frictions of technology in the built environment. So that was a demonstration that we choreographed for all of you. Okay, so I'm here and I've been very much looking forward to tonight's lecture by Andrés Jaque. He's the founder and principal of the New York and Madrid-based Office for Political Innovation. He's a professor and dean of the Columbia Graduate School of Architecture, Planning, and Preservation. In both academy and practice, Andrés is stretching the capacity of architecture. For him, architecture is an entanglement of both spatial and political consequence. This term entanglement he uses often. It's embedded in his interdisciplinary thinking. He's stretching the borders of the discipline, allowing it to entangle with other disciplines without sacrificing our own disciplinary knowledge. This manifests in his practice, where design takes many forms, including performance, research, curatorial practices, and activism. But before I go too far into his practice, I want to share some of the details of Andrés's background. He received a PhD in architecture from the Universidad Politécnica de Madrid, ETSM. He began teaching at Columbia in 2013 and was appointed as the director of the Advanced Architectural Design program in the school in 2018. Concurrently, he taught at Princeton University for 8 years until he became the dean at Columbia, which goes to show that everyone, including Andrés, is limited by a 24-hour day. His work has been recognized across multiple scales and mediums. In architecture, he was the recipient of the Silver Lion in the 2014 Venice Biennale, the Frederick Kiesler Prize in 2016, the 2015 MoMA PS1 Young Architects Prize. In art, he was the chief curator of the 2020 Shanghai Art Biennial and the 2016 Manifesta Biennial. His work is part of the collections of the Museum of Modern Art in New York and the Art Institute of Chicago. But throughout all these achievements, there is a simple idea, which is that architecture is relational. It's part of a complex composite of relationships that are transscalar and inherently political. And I want to highlight 2 early projects of his from 2012, going back in time a bit. I think it's always important to look at these early periods because this is when ideas are in the process of becoming. One project is in pedagogy, and one is a design project. Andrés arrived at Columbia in 2012, and I had arrived at a similar time. We'd both been brought there by at the time, the Advanced Architectural Design director, Enrique Walker. And his first years of studios had quite the impact. His students modeled everything in their projects, from the equipment and the machinery of infrastructure to the plant matter and natural resources of the environment to the objects of everyday life. But more than the furniture, which you typically would do, the appliances, the clothes, the books, and the toothbrushes, everything. His students' work covered the walls, and their models touched the school's 12-foot-high ceilings. But it was not the excess of these objects that mattered, but actually the relationships, the compositive relationships that are between them, between architecture and infrastructure, between nature and interiors, between objects and bodies. His students designed architecture, but they also learned about the agency that architecture has beyond its own walls. In parallel, his other 2012 project, a design project, Phantom Mies as Rendered Society, was installed in Mies van der Rohe's Barcelona Pavilion and is now part of the Art Institute of Chicago's permanent collection. The story goes, when the Barcelona Pavilion was reconstructed in the 1980s, they built a basement that was not part of the original. We are good now, thank you. Not part of the original. The basement was built to house the cleaning equipment for the maintenance of the architecture above. His installation made this act of maintenance visible, and he distributed the cleaning equipment in different locations of the public space, revealing the messiness that is involved to make the architecture of the Barcelona Pavilion appear timeless. This act of revealing the messiness of our lived environments across time and scales has been a consistent thread in his work. The work of his practice situates, enacts, makes visible, and increases capacity, but most importantly, is always optimistic and at times even joyful about being a designer in the world today. So I'm so pleased to welcome Andrés to the Knowlton School.
Thank you. Fantastic. Thank you so much. That's an amazing presentation. Thank you very much, Fu. Thank you very much, everyone, for being here. I'm very excited to be here with you. And also, when Fu has been chair already for 2 years, and the effect of what you're doing is very visible to everyone, I think, in our architectural community around the world. So I'm very excited to be here and witness all that you guys together are doing, which is so exciting and impressive. And I think that Fu is, I would say, I very much admire the work that you've done through your office and also as a teacher and I would say pedagogical innovator. And I think it's right. It's the right connection between design and a larger agenda that exceeds the what in the past was considered to be the agenda of design, and that it makes your presence here so relevant and also very much connected to, I think, what is happening in the world. And so I'm very excited to be here. I'm going to talk about the politics of transcolor architecture. Transcolor architecture is actually not a decision. Well, I would claim that any architecture is transcolor in the same way that any architecture is political. It's transcolor because architecture always is, even at the scale of buildings, if you think of a building, the building is always operating at the smaller scale, at the larger scale. Every building is planetary, I would claim, in the same way that is microscopical. And I will explain more this. Actually, these photographs are too large in a way. I would like to have just the sign here. The sign is an effect that is constructed by connecting things that happen at the scale of mines or geological existence, I would say, and at the also tiny scale of molecules. At the same time, I think it's also something that happens at the very fast time of kind of a glare, as it happens also at the very slow time in which particles of or kind of molecules of titanium or kind of aggregation of titanium ends up being part of a place like Koloveni. I'm going to talk about these things through a series of projects that are basically both design projects and research projects. All of them have been thought of as relational technologies in the way that Fu was explaining, and all of them are responding to questions and needs and urgencies that go beyond the needs of architects, but that definitely architecture has a great role on shaping them. So I started with shininess, and I will conclude this talk with this kind of porosity and non-shininess. The work that I'm explaining here today is very much also the result of years of research also, and performances and interventions, installations that are very much articulated also as, I would say, a way to approach architecture that it's in this book, Superpowers of Scale. But I'll start with the project that Fu mentioned. This is a photograph that I really love. I took it many years ago, I think in 2007, if I'm not wrong. For me, it's very exciting because it's a photograph of a part, basically a never photographed part of one of the most photographed buildings in the history of modern architecture. This is precisely the Barcelona Pavilion or the reconstruction of the Barcelona Pavilion that was done in the 1980s, following the original design of Lily Reich and Mies van der Rohe of 1929. What you see here is the inner pond with the Kolbe sculpture, the down. And what we see here is a very different way of understanding this sculpture in a much more pragmatic way. Architecturally, this sculpture also needs to have the loan taken to the ground, and that's happening through this column that is going through this basement. As Fu mentioned, this basement, the original pavilion in 1929 had a tiny basement. No one knows really where it was, and there's not really a record, but probably was just a tiny sanitary device. But when it was reconstructed, Christian Felice, Fernando Ramos, and and Ignacio Sola Morales, the architects of the reconstruction, decided to add a basement that would occupy the entire footprint of the pavilion. There were many reasons to do that. As Fu said, it was the place where all the equipment that was needed for the maintenance of the building would be kept and hidden in a way. But also it was the place where, for instance, the failed experiments by which the building was reconstructed could be also somehow preserved and also kept invisible. For instance, what you see here on the right, on the bottom right, basically behind the column that is holding the load of the sculpture, it's a series of plexiglass panels, acrylic panels that were actually used in the 1980s to clad the bottom of the lake that you see above. But they didn't work. After a while, the plexiglass, the acrylic panels started to curve, and then they were removed and replaced by pieces of glass. So this piece of glass that I showed you here is actually a piece of this cladding from the bottom of the lake, of the pond, that got broken when one of the employees of the pavilion stepped on the water to clean it up, and basically it broke, his weight made the glass break, and it was removed to be replaced by another piece of tinted glass. What we see here, therefore, it's also the result of the making of the pavilion as an experimental tentative construction, something that is not directly coming from Mies van der Rohe's brain. It's showing the incapacity to translate someone's thinking into architectural materiality. There's all these other layers of societal construction, experimentation, industrial production, industrial innovation, fund making or raising, that are necessary to move from, let's say, human brains into architectural production. That huge, basically, space of other constructions are showing how architecture is never a personal project, it's always a collective project, a project that is societal by nature. But surprisingly, architectural discourse, modern architectural discourse, tends to eliminate all that, to explain architecture as the product of a direct translation of human intentions into materials. All those mediations that show architecture as collective, ecological, societal, are kind of complicating the discourse of an architecture that can be drawn on a napkin and then reproduced, materialized as a piece of reality. But what is that reality that is erased by this basement? What is the reality that it's kept invisible or invisibilized, is invisibilized by the pavilion? When we see the left bottom image, we see that there's a microwave oven. For me, this is fascinating. Why a microwave oven could not be on the upper floor, right? Why we could imagine perfectly a little travertine table with a microwave oven on the upper floor, right? There's something that makes it not really work, right, in our mind as aesthetic proposition. If we work within the modern ideas that somehow we relate to Mies. But it's important to see that it's basically labor and kind of service labor what needs to be invisibilized. Also, mundane needs like eating seem not to be welcome in the upper floor, or not in the way that they are performed when people have lunch here on a daily basis. However, if we see the images that are basically placed on the wall, it's surprising that that's a language, this kind of collage of cultural images, which are mainly the invitations from museums and other cultural institutions that the pavilion gets, that the employees are collecting and putting on the wall. That kind of collage making, that montage language, is very connected to what Mies van der Rohe and Lily Reich made possible. For those that are familiar with the work of Mies van der Rohe and Lily Reich, you remember probably the huge dedication to collage that they had before, during, and after they work on this pavilion. And how actually that was something that Slutsy and Colin Rowe interpreted as a way of transparency, that was actually making it possible that different societal connections or realities could be perceived as simultaneous. This idea of society constructed in the coexistence, in the simultaneity of heterogeneous components is actually the base of a big part of our political thinking. Making compatible the heterogeneity is behind many of the political ideas that have circulated in the last centuries. So for me, there's this kind of unresolved tension here. When Mies van der Rohe came to the US, one of the first interviews that he gave, he was asked, what were the magazines, the design magazines, that helped you develop your idea of what an architect, what kind of architect you wanted to be? And he responded, I actually never paid too much attention to architectural magazines. What I read were political magazines, but not politics. He made a kind of a clarification. Not politics, like the political parties. The type of politics that I'm interested on are politics like Walter Lippmann would talk about politics. For those that are familiar with the thinking of Walter Lippmann and how it's been interpreted in the last decades, Walter Lippmann has been considered one of the founders of the material politics, the politics that are explaining how public realm can be produced out of technology, can be produced out of the difficulties of not doing it without mobilizing technology, architecture, urbanism. And that's why people like Bruno Latour were so obsessed with Walter Lippmann and John Dewey, of course, as well. But for me, this connection of Mies van der Rohe and Mies van der Rohe as an architecture that was concerned about the politics of composition and heterogeneity somehow is lost in the way this pavilion was reproduced. And many other kind of traditions of modernity could be activated by looking at this pavilion. I claim that architecture has a huge unexplored legacy. We still have not exhausted what buildings like this what we can learn from buildings like this if we know how to look at them and how to ask the right questions to them. So this is a project about interrogating architecture in a pragmatic way, not with kind of these idealistic ideas of naive notions of how brains can be immediately translated into architecture, but rather looking carefully to all these layers that are in between. This is the base of what I'm interested on as an architect, and this is also the idea of the political that I'm interested on. When we look at these pieces, we also see, again, that there's so much in these compositions that it's related to Lily Reich as well. And for those that are familiar with the exhibitions that see design of industrial products, this composition could not be more related to that, right? When we see this curtain, for instance, that is actually much lighter than the original curtains. The original curtains came from the German tradition, very heavy silk velvet. And these are much lighter because they are produced in Catalonia. In the velvet tradition in Germany was very connected to the court, to the royalty, to the performance of aristocracy in interiors, and therefore it was very heavy. The fabric production in Barcelona comes from the sailing industry, so therefore it needs to be much more lighter. It's really about light ways of capturing the force of the wind. So that's why these curtains are so different when they move from basically German-produced velvet to progressively to the Catalonian velvet. You could see that the lightness is totally different to the photographs that you see. Actually, that's progressive. This is one of the first curtains that was, this is a new curtain and how it's aging. And this is an old curtain that was removed once it basically lost this color. You see that it's much more heavier than the one I showed in the first image. So this movement from very heavy curtains to lighter, as people moved away from the original velvet to the more Catalonian one, for me it's very interesting because it shows that velvet is not just velvet, it's a whole history of technology development that is connected to the needs that there were projected on those materials, industrial produced materials. But still, this image is so fascinating for me, also for other reasons. If you see, this curtain was not good enough to remain in the upper floor because it would show the pavilion as something that is aging, right? That is not produced in an instant moment and stays forever. So it had to be replaced by a new one and kept invisible. But still, if you see, someone took the kind of time and effort of placing a cardboard around it so that it would not be damaged in the contact of the rough concrete of the basement. So there's so much care that is placed in preserving in the basement all these kind of discarded pieces of the upper floor. That's fascinating for me. Why people are so much caring about something that they want to make invisible, right? That's, I guess, that so many people are maybe connected to my interest on this, and that somehow there's already a different reading of the value of these things that is been enacted in this pavilion for many years. Actually, someone took the effort of going in this basement, right? There's already so much care on this. So the pavilion is not just the kind of ideal version that visitors are asked to see, but rather invited to see. But there's also many other people that relate differently to this pavilion. The pavilion is not only what the misknowers know, but it's also what the people that do this plan dedicated time and efforts do. So it's a multiple pavilions. There's so many pavilions in one. The relationship of the upper floor with the lower floor is probably similar to the famous picture of Dorian Gray, right? That somehow to remain as this kind of fantasy of perpetual youth, of non-mediated reality, there's a need for another architectural artifact that absorbs reality. And that's, for me, where I could like to be installed. I mean, I think that maybe there's another way of relating to architecture that doesn't require, that is kind of emancipated from this idealism, and it's much more capable of embracing and operating in reality in a way, or another thing that is much able to capture reality. Both are real, but maybe one of them is more capable of absorbing complexity. The part of the pavilion that I like the best is this little corner, or that I liked the best because it no longer exists in this way. And this is the place, if you see these plastic things, they're on top of one of these posters, or whatever, framed posters, the green and the white, it's where Cat Niebla lived. Let me introduce you to Cat Niebla. This is, as you see, Cat Niebla is on top of the travertine. He's stepping on the travertine here in these images. These are very sad images because Cat Niebla died 4 years ago. I really like Cat Niebla. I followed her for years as she lived in the pavilion. She was taken here when she was just born, and was taken here because there were mice at the pavilion. So someone thought that the cosmopolitical design of the pavilion should not include mice. And therefore she was brought in as a kind of agent of design to contribute to the design by hunting the mice and killing them, basically. Which, of course, makes us think of the violence of architecture. Architecture is sort of deciding what lives, what doesn't live, what is most likely to live and what is least likely to live through very particular forms of design. So architecture is always kind of an ecological design, and definitely Cat Niebla was one of them. When you look at, I mean, the name was not given to her as she was born. She was not always called Cat Niebla. Actually, for years, she didn't have a name. She was just the cat. But they gave this, the people working in the pavilion gave her this name when her eyes started to be foggy. If you look at her eyes, they were actually very much showing like a kind of veil, a white veil. And progressively that accentuated. That was the result of living in the darkness of the basement. She spent most of her life in the basement because the cat should not be visible. It was part of the basement. the fact that there was a cosmopolitical design behind the pavilion, that there was a need to daily hunt mice to make sure that there were not mice there, was something that no one wanted to know, or not at least those that were making the decisions of how the pavilion should be run. So in order to preserve the pavilion, this fantasy that the pavilion was mice-free, not only the cats should be there hunting them, but the very act of hunting should be hidden. So, so by being in the dark, so she would be the entire day in the basement, and she would only be allowed to be in the upper floor during the night when visitors were no longer there. So she would live in the darkness. And by being in the darkness, she developed macular atrophia, and she ended up being blind. So for me, it's very interesting because, in a way, I'm sad in many ways, but also very interesting because lovers, let's say, like probably all of us, when we visit the pavilion, we're basement blind. We don't see the basement. It took me weeks to find out that there was a basement there because there's not even a visible door to the basement. But the cat was kind of blind. So how she was part of the pavilion shows very clearly that there's multiple pavilions. The pavilion, it's not only one pavilion, but it's one pavilion there's several pavilions according of how that's socialized and constructed as a relational reality. But also the second learning from me is that architecture is always about reflectivity. We, of course, as architects, produce architecture or contribute to produce architecture, but at the same time, we're also produced by the architecture. This incapacity to situate design as something that only one actor does makes me think of this notion of politics and relational architecture implies that architecture is co-produced and that architecture is distributed, that we are architecture in the way that the relational schemes we become part of affect even our materiality, not only what we do and how we do it, but even physically what we are, in the same way that we transform the space and the technologies and the materiality that surround us by the way we are part and we associate with it. This reflectivity is one of the, I would say, principles of ecology, of the ecological paradigm we live through now intellectually and politically. And I think that this is something that changed what architecture, how architecture can be characterized. The second thing is that from this perspective, I would say that architecture is always bodied. I would not say embodied, but following Judith Butler's proposal, I would say bodied. It's bodied. It's basically happening through bodies, as bodies. And the third thing is that from this perspective, design is never kind of a new creation from scratch. Every design is a redesign. What Kat Niebla was doing was not really designing the cosmopolitics of the pavilion, but contributing to re-articulate them, to redesign them. There was never a tabula rasa here, in the same way that Mies van der Rohe was and Lilienrij were not basically creating something from scratch, were mobilizing onyx from Argilia that was traded in Berlin, that was then combined with the velvet that was produced by the German industry, with the intention that it could then be sold and exceeding the limits of the Versailles Treaty to the Latin American economies that were attracted by the Seville Fair that was happening exactly at the same time in 1929 that the Barcelona International Fair was happening. So, and there was a train that was connected the commissioners from places like Argentina, from Buenos Aires, Bogota, La Habana, that were coming attracted by the Seville Fair and would then go to Barcelona to buy construction materials for the growing cities of the 1930s in Latin America. And that is actually part of the pavilion. So it's all kind of an articulation of many realities rather than the new beginning. So as part of this research, I was invited by the Mies van der Rohe Foundation to work on an installation on the pavilion. And what I did basically is playing or following this dynamic and this notion of architectural design as rearticulation, thinking that my job as a designer or our offices work as designers would be to rearticulate the way these realities related to each other. And we brought many of these things from the basement to the upper floor, and we took many things from the upper floor to the basement. But that was not just the movement of things, it was a rearticulation also of the way they related to other things. For instance, what you see here, the vacuum cleaner or the catcher, they were daily used. They were not just elements that were exhibited. They were the actual devices or technologies that were used to clean the pavilion during the time that this installation was shown. So every day there would be someone that would, the cleaning staff would get to the podiums, could get the vacuum cleaning, would use it, and then bring it back. And that implied, for instance, that they would make decisions of what would be exhibited. They became the curators. Actually, they were asked when visitors could come, when they could not, what is the parts that they needed them not to touch. And there was a whole rearticulation of how the dynamics, the societal dynamics of the pavilion would work. Or for instance, for a long time, this installation prevented the lake from being cleaned, and therefore it accumulated leaves, and so the entire ecosystem also started to change, and there were flies and mosquitoes growing in the lake because they could not put the same chemicals in it. So the entire reality of the pavilion started to change by reorganizing what would be in the basement and what could be in the upper floor. This is kind of the theoretical frame in which we've been operating in the Office for Political Innovation that I founded in 2003 with a number of people that were coming from different fields, from sociology and anthropology, mostly close to the methodologies of the SDS, with people that were working as ecologists, with designers, with artists, with filmmakers, in a kind of very messy organization that allowed us to do many things and explore architecture not as something that operates in a single medium, the medium of buildings, but also through installation, films, performances, books, exhibitions, and many other things, actually. That was actually very helpful to somehow not only to learn how to work from this relational perspective, but also to unlearn many things that we had learned in the school. And for me, that was also the opportunity to define some lines of work that you see in this video of the exhibition, the retrospective that was dedicated to our work, I think something like 10 years ago, when all these initial projects were already shown. But today I'd like to talk about more recent projects that are the ones that we're working on now and that kind of absorb all our energy. This is not a project of us, but what I'm going to explain is a research and installation that we've done that was presented in the last Venice Biennial, curated by Leslie Lockham. This is actually New York, where I mostly live now, or I live most of the time now, and it's the Vessel by Heatherwick Architects. This is actually a way of a form of signiness that is very unknown. That was actually, it's very new. 10 years ago, 5 years ago, no one had seen this kind of signiness. It's the result of a very particular use of titanium oxide. It became actually now ubiquitous with the way that iPhones started to use the same material, and you probably noticed that the edge of the iPhones is incredibly shiny, right? And actually titanium is the new advertisement since last summer, right? We were surprised because we were doing this research we had been for 2 years doing this research, and then we knew that there was something going on there. We presented this installation, this research, and then it became like the big thing to advertise iPhones. titanium is actually what makes possible this level of shininess. But when we look at titanium, it's not just a material, it's a whole transformation of the geographies of planetary geographies and geographies of extraction and labor and health. What you see here is the installation that we presented in the last Venice Biennial. And it's basically the different architectural sites where the making of this shininess is allocated. And those sites are operating at very different scales. It's the entire scale of New York City or Manhattan, but also the east coast of South Africa, where Kolobeni Yards is, where the titanium is extracted, but also the very particles of titanium and how they are presented in the sand where it is extracted. This is Hudson Yards. As you know, one of the latest developments or kind of redevelopments of New York, it comes as kind of an opportunity to use, or it was originated by the opportunity of thinking how to use the surface of these train platforms or train tracks that were basically what allowed New York since the 1950s and 60s to expand into the suburbs. The suburbs were possible because New York had this train system originally that connected to places that were distant but connected and allowed people to come here to the east and west. And but covering the tracks and multiplying the soil or the ground of New York through the Hudson Yards to covering these tracks was actually something that was incredibly expensive, to the extent that no real estate scheme would make it feasible. In order to pay for that huge investment, New York, there was a strategy that was developed in New York that was basically making it possible through a gerrymandering scheme to connect the Hudson Yards with some of the areas in East Harlem that had the lowest, the highest unemployment rates. So by basically claiming that this was a consolidated zone that was directly connecting Hudson Yards here to some of the areas in New York with the lowest employment rates, and including, of course, places like Central Park that was neutral, basically they could claim that Hudson Yards was a good candidate, a kind of a top candidate to get federal funding for the promotion of employment. And they could claim that by constructing this platform on top of the tracks, there was a big opportunity to produce employment. But when we see this platform, actually, it's not only a question of basically covering. The trains that arrive to New York, they break in a very short distance. And that relieves a very significant amount of energy. It works when the tracks are open because the energy dissipates in the air. But when you cover them, you would basically be able to boil water on top of the tracks. In order to release that energy, the whole system of Hudson Yards, all the buildings work like chimneys. They all have chimneys that take the air from the space underneath the platform and take it up there on top of the buildings where the temperature is not going to be registered by the interiors. So in order to move this air, there's permanently 16 jet engines that are installed in the platform that are permanently on. So imagine what happens in Hudson Yards. It's like having 8 airplanes permanently basically functioning in between the tracks and the upper piazza. Actually, if you go there, the sound is unbearable, but our brain is very much equipped to erase it, to not allow us to perceive it. I've been there with microphones recording it, and you see the nails going crazy, but still, you see the people there not perceiving it, and you yourself, you don't perceive it. When we look at these engines, these jet engines, these are all the different pieces. This is the one that is most sensitive. This is the one that accumulated more innovation. And this is precisely the one that is produced by titanium alloys, as you see here. Why? Because this is the one that is most exposed. This is the piece that is most exposed to the air, both to the heat of the air, but also to the heavy metals that comes with the air that rust, that make any metal rust. So that's why it needs to be titanium. Titanium has a huge capacity to absorb energy, or to resist to energy exposition, but also it really resists corrosion, rustiness. When we looked at the surface of the Hudson Yards, it's not only the metal what shines, but also the glass. The glass is actually it's not only ultra clear glass. We actually dedicated so much time to research on ultra clear glass, but I'm not going to talk about that today. But it's also self-cleaning glass, a kind of a new advanced version of the ultra clear glass. That's actually something that requires a coating, the same coating of titanium. This glass is actually shines in a very unique way. If you've been there, you will see that the glass and the metal shine in ways that are not known. Actually, these are some photographs that Iwan Ban, the architectural photographer, sent me. And when he saw our installation in Venice, he texted me and said, "Wow, I knew there was something going on in Hudson Yards. I took these weird photographs of the shininess of it, and I knew that there was something very dark here, but I didn't know that it was this." When we look at the surface of titanium, this is happening at a kind of molecular scale. The titanium particles are actually having this effect on glass. So basically, they are so smooth, they produce such a smooth surface. You can see it here in the previous image, like basically the assemblage of molecules of titanium oxide is very perfect. So actually, it makes it very difficult it really allows the water to kind of circulate very, very rapidly. It doesn't allow it to form these drops. That's not the only effect. It reflects light in a particular way that makes sun reflect on them in a very intense way, and therefore it photocatalyzes the particles of dust on the glass. That means that the particles of dust on the glass become much smaller, very simple light particles that when it rains basically and because the drops are immediately kind of dissipated in the glass, it basically swipes down the particles of dust, and as an effect of that, basically the glass remains clean and shiny. But this titanium can only be extracted in a few parts of the world, namely on the East Coast. The most important site where titanium is extracted is the East Coast of South Africa, in particular in a place that is called Kolobeni. These are photographs of Kolobeni. These on the left are photographs of Kolobeni, where we've been doing research, recording, and following the implications of titanium extraction. And what you see at the right is the reconstruction of a very particular form of activism that the people who live, the farmers who live in Kolobeni, have developed to resist the proliferation of mining, of titanium mining in the area. Because they are farmers and they live in a very dispersed way. The only way that the South African regulation allows them to claim the right to make decisions on the land as long as they are constituted as a town. But because they live like farmers dispersed, they had it difficult to prove that they are constituting a community. So that was kind of the weak point that allowed the international or the kind of multinational corporations that are operating the mines there to claim that they have no right on the underground mineral assets within their community. So what they did is they developed a very particular urbanism that is a sound urbanism. They gather every month in the same place. They produce these circles and they sing together songs that allowed them to claim that those songs is an architecture, a civic architecture that is the equivalent of having a square that could prove that they are a town. And by creating this kind of temporary song architecture, they succeed in being recognized as a formal community, and therefore had rights to limit the mining activity in their town. This is titanium here, but I will explain that later. No, sorry. But when we see the titanium here in this place, the titanium is the result of basically removing titanium from the sand. It is mixed with the sand. I think I have an image. Let me see. No, it's this one. Sorry, I don't have it. So basically, the titanium is not mined, let's say, like coal. It's not really through galleries. It's just extracted from the sand. The sand contains tiny, dark particles that are titanium. So what basically happens is that the sand is taken, the titanium is removed from the sand, and the sand is placed back on the ground. By doing that, basically, the sand becomes very light because the titanium is what holds it on the ground. And basically, the entire sand becomes so volatile that the town becomes very dusty. And that's awful for farmers because they see their trees dying. So the fruit trees basically no longer produce, the animals die, and they actually have silicosis that they develop after a few years. So as a result of that, their economy is really shrinking, and most of them are starting to see how their younger generations are moving to the cities where they basically are very likely to end up living as homeless in the streets. So they see this activism to be crucial. For me, what is, and this collage is showing that, what is also very, very important to know is that the shininess of Hudson Yards is very much happening at the cost of the dustiness of Kolobeni. Kolobeni's former, let's say, sand, heavy sand, became volatile by extracting something that could make New York shine. And these kind of relationships are invisible. When we look at this building, like the Barcelona Pavilion basement is invisible. When we look at the shininess of our iPhones, when we look at the shininess of these Hudson Yard buildings, we cannot sense the violence that is inflicted somewhere else in the world. So these are, for me, the architectural artifacts that allowed us to, or that I'm trying to do with my team in the office and with many other people, to allow to see these two realities as interconnected, as something that is mutually dependent. The underground, the minerals here are basically connected, and the activity that happens on the surface is clearly connected to Hudson Yards. These are these other architectures, that allowed the people of Kolobeni to claim their land, that for me are so exciting, and there's so much to learn about these forms of urbanism and architecture that somehow I think are the ones that are relevant now. I'm going to play now a song that is one of these songs that they sing to claim their status as a community. And what is very interesting for me is that these sounds are sort of producing a collective narrative that reminds them of this transcalarity, and that claims it and makes it public and something that can be shared. These songs explain how the mining companies go there, how they extract it, how they do it in a way that is producing benefit somewhere else. This is one of the songs. So for me, what you can see here is that there's clearly a design. It's clearly an architecture. It's clearly a public space that is somehow a dissident form of architecture. If we put together Hudson Yards and this, of course, this is an architecture of witness in a way, but something that is actually it's been very effective in confronting the powerful architecture of the shininess in Hudson Yards. This is a little bit what we try to do also with other projects. For instance, this is a project that we developed in Madrid years ago that was also kind of a very simple project of these canopies that were equipped actually to allow people to go there and use that square, huge square, as a place where, without being invited, people could, by using the equipment that was in the basic things like computers, projectors, sound systems, to organize events that could bring together many people without being invited to use. Or for instance, this is a different project of rearticulation. This is a project that we're developing in different phases in Venice, in San Lorenzo. It's a transformation of the San Lorenzo Church as an embassy for the ocean, a kind of a parliament of the ocean that is intended to redesign the way humans relate to other forms, more than human forms of life that are basically distributed in the oceanic system. And that is something that we already finished the first phase, and hopefully we will soon start with this one. I mean, nothing is easy in Venice in terms of licenses and permits. But for instance, one of the parts is to provide the space and the conditions for the entire envelope of the building to become a space that welcomes and nurtures forms of life that have disappeared in the last years in Venice due to the acidification of the ocean. Or for instance, maybe the most ambitious part of this is this kind of new version of a fresco that is collecting information from around the world. This is for TVA 21, the Thyssen-Bornemisza Foundation. They have votes, scientific votes in different parts of the world that are collecting data. And this is the place where this data is consolidated as a kind of parliament of the ocean, where the project is that artists, scientists, activists, policymakers can have the opportunity to meet together, not only with all of them, but also with other forms of life that are distributed in the ocean and that are very much affected by projects that are, or ideas that are circulating and need to be regulated, like for instance, deep sea mining, which is what we see here in this reconstruction. This is the first phases of this, which is kind of the making of this, I mean, the restoration of the church and the making of this ground. It didn't have even a floor before. Or this project that is actually intended to transform the way New York City deals with its waste. New York City, as many of you know, as many cities, rich cities, basically pays other states to get rid of their waste. The waste, for instance, found in its water is removed through very expensive processes, like what happens in many wastewater treatment plants, and then is accumulated and taken somewhere else to other states. The same happened with a big part of the trash that the city produces. But what we propose is actually a system or sort of a treatment plant that could operate as an ecosystem that could stay right there where the water is polluted. A system that, or a device that could take the water from the sewage system, make it circulate through a series of ecosystems, engineer to make it possible to decompose the particles of waste in tiny ones, to expose them to the UV rays of the sun to kill the bacteria, to then expose them to nitrates, to algae that would eliminate the phosphates and the nitrates on the water, and then go back to the same cycle. And after many times going through this, for the water to circulate through these circuits, the water would be drinkable. And actually, I remember that I drank it. And we had sensors also. We would analyze that every other day, and we ended up having drinkable water in 2 weeks. And actually, myself and many other people drank it, and we ended up fine. We didn't suffer any complication out of that. But for me, it was also kind of a way to test that a place like New York City could change the way. It's a demonstrative architecture that proves that New York City can enjoy the fact that its waste can be treated there, and therefore not rely on kind of environmental segregation or injustice to deal with its waste. A different project that we completed also recently is the Rambla Climate House. And this is a project that starts with, again, it's not something that I could explain without explaining the kind of landscape and ecological and territorial dimension of its effects and its origin. This is Murcia. Murcia is in the southeast of Spain, and it's a territory that is historically been something like this. It's a very dry, kind of almost desert-like ecosystem, but when it rains very heavily. So the land is carved by these veins that are eroded in those moments where the waterfall is very intense. And then the water accumulates. And even if when it dries, the ramblas, these ravines, are actually the places where life accumulates and humidity. They also have, so they both are kind of lines of biodiversity and humidity, but also are climatic regulators of the entire ecosystems and landscapes. This is what it looks like. You can easily identify here the ravines, the ramblas. But this is what it looks like as it was urbanized. From the 1960s, there was a massive urbanization in Murcia of these landscapes, of these territories. And the first thing to do it cheaply, basically, the first action consisted on flattening the land. By flattening the land, the ramblas lost their continuity, and therefore the flow of the water was discontinuous and channeled in pipes. So basically the entire water system was destroyed, and the water no longer could circulate. The biodiversity very rapidly dropped, and the climatic regulatory effect of the ramblas disappeared. Of course, we know what happened. So basically our commission was tiny, was to do a very modest middle class, I would say, house for 2 people and their 2 kids. But what was fascinating is that the lot that they had, that was really nothing fancy, but was a remaining and disconnected part of a ravine. So a ravine that no longer got water because it was disconnected from what used to be the course of the ravine. But we basically thought that there was a possibility of using the gray water of the house, the water that we could collect from the showers and also from the roofs, from the rainfall, to repair the lost humidity within the ravine. And we were very lucky that this happened through COVID. So basically the entire process became longer. So what you see here is already 3 years of the water reclaimed from the daily use of the house, the effect that it had in repairing this ravine, in restoring this part of the ravine. The house is organized around this piece of decaying ravine. The water was collected from the roofs and from the showers, taken to a little tank where we basically work with, this is the collaboration with a number of edaphologists, experts on soil, as the ecosystems of soil, and ecologists from the area, actually activists, not only scholars from the Universidad de Murcia, but also activists that wanted to help us on this project because they wanted the house to become sort of another demonstrative architecture that would help raise awareness on the damage that flattening of land had produced in the landscape. This image I love. It's a photograph by Jose Evia that I really like because I think it shows really both the damage on the soil, but also the earlier effects of its reconstruction or reparation. And I love also to see that there's a form of daily life in this house that is very much about observing and contributing to the reparation of the landscape, and very much gaining awareness of how much human life depends and can do also for. And these are images that I'm getting from, this is something that they sent me a few weeks ago from in a WhatsApp. But it's so exciting to see how they are really witnessing the kind of reparation of a big part of the biodiversity that becomes part of their daily life now. This is a poster that we produced for the Luma Foundation when they, Hans-Ulrich Schobrit and Maya Hoffman asked us to think what we could claim as an architectural program for the future. What was urgent? That was the question. What is urgent that architecture does? And we claim intra-species justice. And I think that this is maybe it's not definitely something that goes against other notions of justice. I would actually claim we cannot have other forms of justice if we don't acknowledge that how we relate to nature, it's always intersecting any other forms of justice. And I would like to finish with this project, which is really a project against signiness somehow. So I think it's a good way to close this discussion, which is the radio school that we completed, I think now a year and a half ago. And it's been kind of a long process, but very, very exciting. This is a project that, of course, is, like projects are not something that can be reduced to words, right? But there's always ways to approaching their interpretation by looking at a specific kind of theoretical or theory tools that can allow to identify a few things that are happening here. I think this project can very well explain through a series of different notions of what ecology as a paradigm can mean for architecture. And what can mean as situated in an economy that is very different to the LEED certificates and the kind of Northern European or US corporate capacities, but also notions. For instance, this is a building that is not produced, it doesn't have a wooden structure, it doesn't have actually a LEED certificate or anything like that, it doesn't have that kind of sophisticated management of its performance, but it has very simple things, like for instance, an incredibly naked building. By doing a building that is incredibly naked, where everything's visible, we managed to reduce 38% the materiality of the building. Only that would produce much more energy consumption and emissions reduction than any other change that you could imagine. We calculated, we compared all of them basically, and basically that was the best way for us to reduce its environmental impact. But not only that, when we did this very naked building, the mechanical systems, its structure, its functioning, became part of the pedagogy, something that could be easily understood and become part of the learning. This was very much also something that we wanted to make sure we did. This is a building that is for the Reggio, is within the tradition of the Reggio schools. Reggio Emilia was very influenced by John Dewey, and this idea that rather than learning from a curriculum, the students should learn from a critical approach to the daily experience. So basically, how you basically experience buildings, relationship with other people, nature on a daily basis, and how you interrogate that experience is how you learn. And that's why in the Reggio Emilia pedagogical tradition, they call the building the third teacher. So the first is the formal teachers, the second is the family and friends, the third is the building for them. And for us, it was very exciting to see, and this became actually an obligate kind of a mandatory part of the education. There's a teacher that explains kids every year how the building operates as part of their education. The school, a second way of understanding this ecological kind of approach for us was also to see that this is not only the result of us as architects designing, but it was a highly participated process that was actually accumulating ideas from many different people. It was actually through the interaction, and these are, for instance, this is one of the thousands of drawings that kids produce in the meetings that we had with them, with parents, with teachers, with tutors, with many people together, and you see actually how many of these, how close it was already to the design of the building that we ended up having. A fourth idea that is very important for me has to do with the connection of basically the intersection with publicness. This is a very typical floor plan of a school, right? We would easily identify that schools have been operating as a kind of horizontal dispersion of functions. But what is also very interesting is that the buildings are basically producing enclosures, like enclosements, like basically they're enclosing and privatizing pieces of land that are then given a very specialized use, and that equally produces a very spatially exclusive and excluding community that have access to it. We are so used to see buildings, these horizontal buildings, that of course we can love many of these like many examples of these typologies. I'm thinking of the Darmstadt schools by Sahun, and I totally love them, of course, and there's so many that, or the Giancarlo Di Carlo, right? But in a way, it's very important to see how this became sort of an architectural standard that was almost never challenged, and that it's actually incorporating without being explored and scrutinized the idea that schools should be providing privatized environments for kids to basically be educated in the contact with very similar people and excluding others from interfering their education. What we did is radically different. We actually recommended, and the promoters of the school, which is actually a cooperative of teachers, do not look for a very spread and big piece of land, but rather a tiny one, well connected to the systems of public transit. We told them that it was much better to be connected to an urban environment than basically having a huge amount of land, and that actually we would recommend to do a very vertical building, a building that would stack uses on top of each other rather than expanding them, and a building without a playground. We thought that it was the most progressive thing they could do is actually find a location that had enough public space where the school could actually expand into the public rather than privatizing and control who could have a kind of interaction with those kids as they were growing. We thought that actually education, if we took seriously what the Reggio Emilia meant and the John Dewey tradition, was really about exposure and friction in the relationship with others that are different to you. And it was great to see that there was so much sympathy. They were so happy about these ideas. And the building ended up being a very vertical building, almost, I would say, a little skyscraper of social complexity that never had a courtyard, a playground, and that was actually accumulating pieces of playground within the building, inside the building or outside in the building. The location was key. The building is in that green thing over there, and is adjacent to this huge public space. It's really not a fancy public space. It's actually a former landfill. Actually, this was for decades. This was the place where all the trash in Madrid came to. That was a time that actually that was interrupted already in the 1950s. So actually the level of toxicity here is not that high. But still, when you're there, there's almost no insects. The biodiversity is very low. It's a very nice green space now, very extended, well maintained, I would say, but with incredibly low levels of biodiversity. This is a video that I totally love. It makes me laugh so much and also sort of cry of emotion. This is the first day that they opened the gates of the building so that the kids could start playing in this park. So actually this is the moment that they actually started to enjoy this, and it's so funny to see them running. You also see the teachers very concerned, both making videos, but also kind of, oh my God, how are we going to watch them? But it all worked quite well. Actually, this is amazing. In one of the moments, you see the neighbor. Now you see there's this gray, ugly building by our building. That one there. That is kind of an elder residency, like a nursery home or whatever it's called. And so it's very, very beautiful now to see the old people taking their foldable chairs, and at the moment that they know the kids are going to take their break, and they talk to them, and they actually, there's another form of safety in a way that is being produced by basically having many people around that are permanently watching the kids. But for me, this is so exciting. You see also that as an ecosystem is nothing special. It's actually very poor. You see that, you can see the soil is very white. It's very, it's really not good. There's a few trees that are kind of decaying. And that's something of the result, of course, of being a landfill for decades. But that was very important for us. The building has not only the capacity to to activate socially this huge park, but also to contribute to its reparation. So thinking of the experience of the Rambla Climate House that I explained before, what we did is inject small gardens that were very much designed to promote biodiversity, to nurture biodiversity that could then expand into the park. This is the building as it was finished. This is other parts of the building. You see how the building itself is also an accumulation of architectural diversity. That was very important for us. There's many different traditions within the building. There's, you know, the tradition of the agricultural facilities with the greenhouse and the tiny kind of warehouse-like accumulation of buildings around it, to this more civic architecture of infrastructures and big span structures that we love. It's the most public part. This is both the gym and the theater and the assembly part of the building of the school, and it's the place where we basically did these big span structures that allowed for these aggregations to be happening simultaneously. Like the entire school can be here, but for instance, this is the lowest part, which is really where the youngest kids are, which is really like a small architecture, almost like a domesticity, like a tiny home, and other parts that are imbricated within the trees. This is another house that we did in Ibiza many years ago that is allowing the trees to go through, and that is actually designed so that not the roots, not the branches are affected. The architecture of the building is actually allowing to collect the rainfall in a very simple way, and then it's distributed to all the building, to all these tiny gardens that we designed with Mingo Basarrate and a pair of amazing ecologists that helped us design each of the gardens so that it could basically restore the presence of particular species that were needed to pollinize the whole park and contribute to basically progressively increase its biodiversity, learning from what we had done before. You see, for instance, here, some of these gardens are really tiny. What we thought is like, you see that garden there, for instance, it's really tiny, but that's the garden that is multiplying the presence of bees. And of course, it's crucial. Another one is, for instance, very important because it's bats, no, not bats. You know, this kind of, bats, that are crucial to keep the population of mosquitoes under control. And the final element that for me is the most exciting and the most complicated, I mean, these are photographs that the kids basically took of as they were doing representations of the school, and as basically when they first arrived to the school, they were given these Polaroid cameras to take photographs, and they were asked to add a sentence to it. And I love this one, which is, "My school looks like a robot made out of butter." And the butter is the part that was the most complicated in the school. And it's actually this facade that then won many awards, made us many awards. But initially we were we didn't know if we were doing something great or something really awful with this facade. But it's out of cork. We made so many experiments of how to accumulate cork. Basically, it's projected cork. So it's grinded cork mixed with bioresins in different densities or kind of concentrations. And then it's projected one layer, another layer, many times. So it becomes very thick, something like this. And it's great thermal isolation. It's very cheap because it's basically projected. So you don't really need to, and you put it on top of bricks, regular cheap bricks. I mean, it's like in Spain, bricks are very, not the bricks that you do for a facade, but the light ones, the kind of the super light ones. And you can do that super cheap, and if you leave it like that. But what is very beautiful is that we did basically our experiment, the facade that we developed basically was made in a way that the first layers had a high concentration of bioresin, but as we get closer to the external final layer, it had less and less and less resin. So the kind of the last inch is very porous. and it allows for plants, moss, lichens to root there. It actually, the form is helping to accumulate minerals and dust and particles. So it's totally the opposite of this glass and titanium thing in Hudson Yards. It's actually meant to get dirty, very dirty, to the extent that it will accumulate the soil that would allow life to grow. It's already happening, and I'm very excited that this process is much faster of what we thought. And we're now developing a new version, more radical, with the same people that we did this one, that is going to be presented next year in the London Design Museum. But what I'm I love about these photographs is that you see there the Real Madrid towers. You see those 4 towers? That's kind of the equivalent in Madrid of Hudson Yards. It's not as advanced as the titanium facade, but it still claims this shininess. One of them is by Norman Foster, the other is by... But for me, it's great to see this contrast between these 2 different ways of understanding the surface of a building. One that is really producing inequality globally. The other one is very much doing a huge effort to improve and better and repair what is around it. And I have the feeling that we're entering a very different time for architecture. My hope is that in a few years, the facade of this becomes something like this, and I think it's happening already. And I think when we look at this, we probably, no one would prefer shininess to something like this, right? Thank you very much. I don't know if you normally do questions, do you? Yeah, I'm super happy to respond questions, complaints, whatever. Things that are not clear, yeah. You want to start? Yeah.
So we follow the path of the titanium from where it was harvested to where it ended up. How are you able to harvest the cork in such a way that it doesn't
Yeah.
impact those?
That's a great question. I didn't refer to that, but it's something that we've done so seriously. And actually, the first project that I did as an architect with my office was a clergy house in Plasencia, in Extremadura, very close to the border of Spain with Portugal. And I would drive or take the train. At that time, there was a very bad train. You had to change 5 times train to get from Madrid there, so we ended up driving most of the time. Sometimes we also took the train, which is so beautiful because it goes to this amazing landscape. It's a very poor area of Spain that is very isolated, so they still have a kind of landscape that is beautiful because it's where one of the best hams is produced, like prosciutto, and that's because there's these amazing cork trees that they have a very dense shadow underneath. So the pigs go there and they eat the fruit of these trees, and then they sleep there. And because it's so the shadow is very intense, it's very nice, it's very fresh, and also it accumulates water normally, and so they find everything there: the shadow, the food, the water. Is incredibly nice, and it's a very dry landscape again, right? So they live, the pig live wild there. They are free. They're not farmed. They basically are allowed to live there, and then they take them and kill them and produce the prosciutto, you know. So they have a very good life until they are killed. But the landscape is so beautiful, and you see the coexistence of people that live out of that without working too much. Those that are and the animals that are kind of reasonably well taken care of, or kind of living on their own, and the trees. The same happens with the cork, because the cork is removed from the tree. Every 10 years they remove the kind of the out. So basically the cork trees, the circulation of it's happening inside the trunk, and so the outer part is dead, and you can remove it. Every 10 years they take it, and it's kind of a perfect thing. You don't need to kill the tree to extract something that is incredibly useful and valuable. The good thing about the to use grinded cork instead of kind of cork itself is that you can use the kind of waste of other processes of using the cork. And the good thing is that it's surprisingly it's incredibly well connected to this place in Madrid. Like environmentally, you see the connection. There's so many things. Like for instance, when you see the weather broadcast or whatever, you see how the clouds always come through there. You know, Extremadura, it's like that, and very naturally connected, but also not that far. It's 2 hours from here, from this place. So for me, it was very exciting to see that the core was coming from there, where there's this economy that is so important and that works so well. And even though this community is kind of not rich, it's not poor. So it's sort of people that live out of what they do and preserving an ecosystem that is incredibly rich, that provides everything and that makes life kind of not bad for many species, right? Even for the trees. So I was very excited that we could use this and work with that. And so, but yeah, so I see this totally different to the Coloveni in a way also at that level. So I'm happy that you asked this. I saw the question there, right? Somewhere. Okay, sorry. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Your presentation focused mostly on your work outside of teaching.
Yeah.
But I'm wondering, as Dean at Columbia, what are things that you're most excited about in Columbia GSAPP?
Yeah.
In the next few years, or maybe currently, that you think is most exciting right now?
Well, I think Colombia is amazing. I don't think I could do any of this. I mean, I talk about projects that I don't do in the US because I think the US, I don't have a connection with the local context of people beyond architecture. You know, I mean, I have friends from museums, art scenes, you know, writers, filmmakers, whatever. But I don't have a connection with people that need architecture. The most intense thing that some people need around me in terms of architectural services is, I don't know, the design of an exhibition or a kind of fancy penthouse, you know, whatever. So I don't see that much of a need, you know. I don't think that there's a need to think new ways of designing a penthouse for me, from what I do, you know. I think the architectural commissions that are exciting are a little bit more needed, you know. So, and I don't have those kind of connections. So I'm happy to work in mostly in Europe or in Latin America or in other places, and somehow it gives me a distance. But I must say that all the ideas come from my interaction with contexts that are very much going through Colombia and through the friends that I have there, people that I keep talking to, like John Jonas or Cecilia Vicuña, artist friends, or Laura Poitras, or architects like Food. We're neighbors actually in New York, and many people that we have like a community, and I think that's very much happening through Colombia. Colombia is claiming that discourse, practice, and activism are inseparable. If you want to do something relevant, there's no way you disconnect these things. If you don't have discourse, you're basically a slave of other people's rhetorics. You really have to investigate. You have to think of histories. You have to think of words, of what's happening in different, you know, places where ideas are being debated and innovated. You cannot do anything without activism. We live in a world that we're seeing systems of exploitation, extraction, segregation, really cracking, you know, really taking everything to a very, very, very much a state of crisis. So we really need to react and find ways to build something different in the cracks of all these systems of carbonization, of racialization, of gender inequality, of, you know, we could go on and on, of militarization. I believe that we're in a moment that architecture can only be seen as a form of dissidence, and dissidence that is growing these cracks and allowing other worlds to emerge from those cracks. So I don't see that there's anything that can be relevant that is not activist. And of course, that doesn't mean that we're pure agents of kind of whatever. We're very polluted, we are imperfect, we probably are, it's impossible that we're not connected to forces of evil in some way, But still, we can, as designers, make other worlds emerge in this messiness. And it's happening every day. We are doing that. And I think that we would not be relevant if we don't embrace practice and design and even professions. We cannot leave that void. I think we need to operate transforming the world through structures that exist, all the ones that we can make emerge, but being doing things. We cannot be removing ourselves in a safe location where we can have very intellectual conversations so we can enjoy the purity of our political idealisms. We really need to mobilize our capacity to intervene reality. So these three things are inseparable for me, if you want to be relevant. That's my main claim as a dean in GSAPP. I'm claiming these three layers are working together or we will not be relevant. And the good thing is that Colombia is a place that loves change. And everyone's embracing this and contributing to it in an amazing way. And we're rediscovering how to do that. And for instance, I will give you an example of something that I launched 2 years ago, which is the design clinics. I was talking to some of you before and explaining this. I'm trying, and I'm doing it, it's happening. Everyone's actually too excited about that. Now we have so much work doing this, but we're transforming the studios. The studio is kind of an amazing invention. So much can happen in the studio. It's so unique. When I talk to my colleagues, deans in other schools, they all want to do studios now. Business school wants to do studios, like climate school wants to do studios, the other want to do studios. How do you do studios? They all tell me. But we're also thinking introspectively about the studio. We're not thinking of doing different studios, but doing studios that are more like what studios are. And we've transformed the studios or we're testing the effects of something that we call the studio clinics. The studio clinics are learning from also the tradition of the law schools and the clinics in the law schools. We are working with needs, specific needs, and this comes from Silvia Federici, say like, at this point, we have to focus on something that is needed. So not just kind of exercises or, let's say, abstract speculations, but very situated work. And those needs need to have also another condition. No one knows how to deal with them. There are things that are so difficult that no one could isolate it, kind of one person. There's no one person in the world that can say, I know how to deal with this, you know. So we basically are identifying communities, humans or non-humans, distributed or concentrated, global or I would say planetary or very local, that have a need that no one knows how to deal with. And then we have the luxury of having a huge broad of programs and disciplines within one building. We have architecture, we have planning with its policy capacities and all these things. We have also urban design, which is, of course, a totally different tradition, right, to deal with the urban. We have also, that comes from landscape and kind of systemic analysis. And we have also real estate, which is actually, you know, like in the past it was seen as a problem in the school, right? I'm so excited to see if we can use that knowledge to do things that are not maximizing profit or maximizing other profits, right? Ecological profit or justice profit, right? Or other things. So having basically the studios are no longer only for architects or designers, but are having people from all the different programs. But it's not that everyone's doing the same. Each one is participating with their own specialized knowledge. That was kind of a problem at the beginning because the people from real estate, they wanted to design. I said, no, you have to do the numbers and you have to make sure that we're, you know, like it's, and that was a very, very important thing. We're kind of collaborating, but each one with their specific knowledge, even formats. Some people are part of the clinic with 3 points and other people with 9 points, you know. So some people meet only once a week, other people meet 3 days a week, but there's always a moment that all of them are together. And they're together contributing to a common, let's say, design. And the last thing is that we do it with, not for the people that are in need or people or non-people, because we're dealing with things that often are not represented by humans, right? but we have the commitment of doing it with them, and that's incredibly productive. I told some people, for instance, some of the clinics, I explained before, one that I'm fascinated with is Tuvalu. It's an island in the Pacific that is disappearing. It's one of the first islands that is disappearing in the Pacific because of sea level rise. And then we're working with them, basically with the prime minister and the government, to see how, and the people there, it's a tiny community, right? I mean, we say prime minister, but it's really, I don't know how many people are voting, you know, but it's like, and to see how the island will become something dispersed, how they can retain their relational richness in a dispersed version of what they are now, and also something that will have to be digital to a certain extent, or based on events or moments of convening, right? But also the memory needs to go digital. So that's a very difficult project that Marina Otero and oh, I don't remember now. That they're working is quite amazing. The results are amazing. They come to our build. Another one, for instance, we're working with the last mile of logistics. It's at the ground floor of Midtown, with all the people that are working on the delivery of food and other things in the city, that are connecting basically the warehouses or the restaurants and kitchens with offices or homes. We're really addressing what are the kind of living conditions of all these huge amount of people that are circulating in cities now with bikes, and where we, for instance, the participation of the real estate students and faculty was amazing, because they identified that there was a huge opportunity to use a part of the ground floor of Midtown that in the past had retail uses that are now decaying, to create an infrastructure that would support people that were working on these services, and create actually, and doing it in a way that was actually beneficial for everyone. And so these are the kind of questions that we're doing. And in that case, we were working with the city of New York as well. And so for me, this is incredibly exciting. But it's not only that we're doing. We're doing many other projects. For instance, we're doing a series of things that we're calling now affirmations, that we're really making sure that we're moving from a mode of thinking politically that is about complaining to one that is affirming what is working now. So we're already done 7 of these convenings where we bring together people from many different disciplines with designers and architectural theorists to discuss radical transformations of our societies and ecosystems that are worth claiming. For instance, I'm very excited. In a few weeks, we have one of these events with Paul Preciado, Jack Halberstam, and C. Riley Norton, where we're going to be claiming transness as a culture. So all these, the huge activism and kind of invention of a broad spectrum of gender identities and enactments that have grown in the last years through forms of activism, theory, and also, I would say, design. And we're reflecting on what they imply with 3 of the most important thinkers and activists of transness that happen to have all of them reflect through architecture as architecture. Paul Preciado through the architecture of Playboy and the Hasmonian transformation of Paris, Jack Halberstam through Gordon Matta Clark and the decaying of the piers on West Manhattan, and C. Riley Norton through the architecture of the enslaved fugitives and the way they use the swamps as a space of liberation through gender transitioning, and a very particular relationship with ecology. And I'm so excited with these sessions because they are totally transformative. They're incredibly well attended by faculty, students, and people from all around the campus. But my impression is when we finish one of these sessions, we're different people. We have different notions. For instance, I will give you an example. We have one with Olekan I don't remember his last name, the architect and designer that is working with these amazing images of Afrofuturisms, and we had a conversation with a number of people about why how we use future. What is that we do when we do a rendering of a future scenario of a society, right? If you win the competition to do a library, you present renderings that will show like what will that site look in 10 years, right? With people, books, things. And that was a moment in which we were reflecting on what was the power of that. Because we cannot complain. It's great because we're claiming things that are great, that we should embrace. Those things that I say are cracking in the failure of these systems of extractivism, right? And for instance, it was so beautiful to see how in Leka's work, futurism was a form to announce and to make plausible the not yet to come. Those realities that are possible but are obstructed because of political constraints. And that was crucial, for instance, in the creation of Afro-Imaginarium of emancipation. And we could learn through that basically there's a huge possibility of exploring histories that were repressed or marginalized, and the capacity of architecture to just produce the feeling of what could it be to support that, to empower that, and make that emerge as a reality that could be celebrated and empowered. And I think just by being in that discussion, I think the entire school have changed our relationship with future. So now when we do a rendering, it's not really like a commercial tool to convince others. It's really where we're interrogating where are those histories that were repressed and that we can project to the future and celebrate and empower through our work. And these are tiny, tiny moves, but they accumulate. Now we have many of them, right? So I think that we're infiltrating all this power, I would say, to our practices. And those are tiny moves and I could talk forever. We have many, many plans. I must say that this is very connected to what Fu is doing here. In many ways, I always have these conversations as neighbors, right? And we have conversations and many of these things are also inspired by what Fu has been doing. So.
Thank you, Andrés.